Hi, and welcome to another edition of Todd Talk. Todd Talks are 10-minute instructional videos to take the idea of educational theory and translate it into educational practice. My name is Todd Stanley, and today's episode is going to be entitled Your Child is Gifted, Now What? When a child is identified as gifted by the school, what typically happens is we notify parents that their child is gifted. We send a letter home, we send an email, or we send some kind of communication that lets you know your child is gifted. The problem is then once you get that information, what do you do with that? What does that mean? How are things different? How will things be different? And so today's Todd Talk is to try to get a better understanding of what does it mean that your child is gifted and to have that conversation with your child. So, Dr. James Delisle wrote the book, Understanding Your Gifted Child from the Inside Out. And in it, he suggests when your child is identified as gifted, take time to sit down with him or her and explain in your own words what you think this term means. So, what I want to make sure is that you have a good understanding of what it means to be identified as gifted. And I want to make sure that you can have that conversation with your child and to have a realistic understanding of what it means to be identified as gifted. There are typically three areas that we identify children as gifted in. One of those areas is cognitive. Cognitive is the way that a child thinks, and that they think at a higher level than your typical child. So what this looks like is they're very inquisitive, or they ask a lot of questions, or they're thinking about things kind of, not just the surface level, but going a little beyond that. So they're asking the how and why questions, not just the what, when, and who questions. And so how this shows itself in the classroom is that a kid is really asking a lot of questions and they're just very inquisitive. They just think at a different level. They like to be challenged to think at a different level. So this is if a child is identified in superior cognitive, that's how it might look. The second type of gifted identification is subject specific. So what this means is a child is identified as gifted in math, or maybe reading, or science, or social studies, or it could be multiple areas, but they're identified in that one area using a test. And so students who score well on this or in the gifted range are usually for a couple of reasons. One, they may just have a lot of content knowledge. So if your child was exposed to a lot of reading when they were younger, you read to them as a child and you fostered this love of reading, then they may be very strong at language arts when they get into school. And same thing if you take your child to the science discovery museum a lot, and they really love science as a result of that, then they're probably going to do better than your typical child who did not have those opportunities to do that. So it can come down to content knowledge. But what it can also come down to is the innate ability to perform this subject area. So for instance, there are kids that are just really good at math. Math comes quickly to them. They process it quickly. When a math concept is introduced, they tend to get it pretty easily. And then as a result, they are able to take that into places that maybe other kids are not. And so you tested well. The third way that we identify gifted is creative thinking. And creative thinking is basically a child who thinks outside the box. We call this a divergent thinker, or someone who thinks differently than other people. So an example that is always used is if you were to ask a child to describe a submarine, your typical child may say, well, a submarine is a metal vessel that can go underneath the water and has a periscope. And if you ask a kid who's creative thinking gifted, they may say submarine has two pieces of bread, cheese in the middle, some meat, because they're thinking of a submarine sandwich. They're just thinking of it in a different way. And that's just a basic example, but they tend to look at the world differently and interpret things differently than your typical child would. So those are the three areas that we typically identify giftedness in: cognitive, achievement, and then creative thinking. So your child comes home, or your letter comes home when your child has been identified in one of these areas. what kind of conversation do you have with your child? So my advice is to make sure that you distinguish very clearly that there's a difference between better at than and versus better than. So if a student is better at something, it just may mean that they have ability. So if they're better at math and they score very high, they're better. They're just better at math than your typical child. It doesn't mean they're better than the typical child. And so we want to get out of that idea of the better than, because then that kind of perpetuates the idea of elitism that gifted education is often criticized for. So that's one thing I would definitely do with your child, is just to say you have these gifts. They should definitely be proud of these gifts. But it's always a fine line. So we want to be proud of the fact that you want your child to be proud that they're gifted, but not bragging about it necessarily. It's kind of like that athlete who is very good at athletics, but doesn't brag about themselves all the time. LeBron James is the best basketball player in the world, but he's very humble when it comes. I mean, he works hard and he acknowledges others whenever he's interviewed. So he's very humble. He doesn't brag about himself, and so he doesn't think he's better than the other basketball players. He's just better at basketball. So the way that when we identify kids as being gifted, it usually means that they're there's a curve, a bell-shaped curve in intelligence. And so typically in the middle, your typical child will be right smack dab in the middle. Your gifted kid, on the other hand, is going to be at the upper levels of this curve. And so when it comes down, there's fewer kids who are going to be identified in that area. And then on this end of the spectrum, there is going to be your kids with learning disabilities or have difficulty, processing things. And so it's a bell curve. And so because your child is gifted, it means that they are not your typical kid when it comes to this bell curve. It doesn't mean that a lot of times we try to say, well, it's the normal would be in the middle, but we don't want to use that term normal, because by saying this child is normal, it's saying that this child over here is abnormal. And we don't want gifted kids or the other end of the spectrum to think that they're abnormal. They just are, different. And so I typically want to use the term atypical. So you have your typical kid in the center, and then the gifted kid is your atypical kid. They're kind of, they have scored better than the typical child would. So that's another way to look at it, is atypical versus typical. So your child is gifted. You want to make sure that they understand what this means. And it's important to understand what it does not mean. So I will say that there are 5 things you should never say to a gifted child. And I'm guilty of saying all 5 of these. So I'm by no means passing judgment with people that do. I just know that through my experiences that gifted children kind of take these, and it gives them an unrealistic view of what being gifted is. So the first one is, you're smart, you'll figure it out. So when you tell a kid that, what you're telling them is that they can figure out anything because they're smart. But that's not necessarily the case. People are going to run into things that they can't solve or they can't do. And you want to make sure that your gifted child is equipped with the ability to admit that that's maybe something they can't do. That it doesn't always come down to intelligence. Sometimes it comes down to hard work. It comes down to grit. It comes down to other factors. The second thing you should never say to a gifted child is, so-and-so wishes they were as intelligent as you. So it's the comparison game, comparing your child to someone else. And what that does is it perpetuates the better than idea. You're better than this student because they're so jealous of you. They wish they were that intelligent. So you don't want to say that to a gifted child. They may be fortunate in that they get specialized services that other children don't, but it doesn't mean, again, that they're better than. The third thing that you should never say is, don't ask more questions. Gifted kids tend to ask a lot of questions. Not always, but many of them do. And so this comes from an innate curiosity that they have. And so you should never quash that. This can be annoying because when you're trying to get to sleep and in the hotel room because you're on vacation and the kid's asking questions. And so, that can be a little bit annoying, but you want to make sure that you encourage them to ask questions all the time, and to continue asking questions. The fourth thing you should never say to a gifted child is, "You're gifted. It should be easy." And some teachers, have this idea that because kids are gifted, things should come easy to them, and sometimes that is the case, where things come naturally, I like to say to them. But you don't want to say that it should be easy for them, because what happens then is when a gifted kid struggles, and they will struggle at one point or another, they don't develop a coping mechanism for how to deal with the struggle. So if you have a kid who is used to struggle, then they can overcome that because they've developed coping mechanisms or strategies to overcome that. If you tell a gifted kid, "Well, you're gifted, it should be easy," then they're never going to want to take risks, because if it's not easy for them, they think that they're failing. So you want them to be able to take risks and to not be afraid of failure. The last thing you should never say to a gifted child is, "You're gifted. You should be the top of your class." A lot of times, being gifted does equate to letter grades. So if a kid is gifted in math, they may have an A in math, but not always. And so putting an unreal expectation on gifted kids that because they're gifted, they should get straight A's all the time, can put a lot of pressure on them. And so what starts to happen is that a gifted kid may underachieve. They may fail on purpose because they can't live up to the pressure of what the expectations are. So those are just 5 pieces of advice that maybe don't say to gifted kids, or try to watch yourself saying it. It's going to slip out every once in a while, but do your best with that one. So my final piece of advice is, when you sit down and have this conversation with your kid, is just be genuine. Talk about how you've noticed things that they've done in the past that may have that may not be typical, and kind of defines them as being atypical, whether it's learning to read early, whether it's putting the blocks in different puzzles than everyone else does. It's whether you're watching Scooby-Doo and you ask, "How is Scooby talking?" And so it could be a lot of things. And so you want to make sure that these are kids, they are the typical kid, in that they are emotionally the age that is on their birth certificate. So you want to treat them as such. And so make sure that you love your child, and you don't put too much expectation on them just because they have this label of being gifted.